The wind howled outside the cabin, a lean, hungry sound that mirrored the emptiness inside Alara. It clawed at the ill-fitting door, rattling the single-pane window until she feared it would shatter. Her leg throbbed, a dull, relentless ache that spread poison through her body. Her husband had left 3 days ago, taking the horse, the rifle, and the last scraps of dried meat, but not before he'd kicked her, hard and deliberate, snapping bone against bone. The bruises flowered across her ribs and arm, a grotesque garden of purple and yellow, making even breathing a shallow, cautious act. She lay on the floor near the dead hearth, wrapped in a thin blanket that did little against the encroaching cold. Dust motes danced in the weak shafts of light that penetrated the gloom, highlighting her despair. She was alone, broken, and the gnawing hunger in her belly was a lesser pain than the fear that coiled in her chest. Every creak of the wood, every groan of the wind, was a potential threat. She pictured coyotes, gaunt and desperate, or worse, people. The kind of people who saw a woman alone and hurt not as someone to aid, but someone to prey upon. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of this single, drafty room, a prison of pain and terror. She tried to shift, to reach the water dipper just out of reach, but the movement sent a searing agony up her leg. A whimper escaped her lips, swallowed by the wind. He had said she was useless, a burden. His actions had proven it. Now, left to the mercy of the elements and her own broken body, she felt the truth of his words settle over her like a shroud. She closed her eyes, picturing the vast, indifferent sky outside, the endless miles of unforgiving land. There was no help here. No one knew she was here. She was a forgotten whisper in the wilderness, waiting for the end. The cold was a palpable weight now, seeping into her bones. She shivered uncontrollably, her teeth chattering. This was how it happened. Slow, lonely, erased by the indifferent landscape. She focused on the pattern of the frost creeping up the inside of the windowpane, finding a morbid fascination in its intricate beauty. It was like the patterns of her bruises, spreading and consuming. A soft scraping sound outside the door broke the trance. Her heart leaped into her throat, pounding against her bruised ribs. Not the wind this time, something deliberate. She held her breath, every muscle tensed despite the pain. The scraping stopped. Silence stretched, taut and unbearable. Then, a heavy thud, as if something large was set down. More silence. Was it him? Had he come back? The thought brought a fresh wave of terror, worse than the cold, worse than the hunger. Or was it someone else? A trapper? A wanderer? Friend or foe? In this place, the lines were blurred, often indistinguishable. The door creaked open slowly. Not kicked in, just opened. A tall, broad silhouette filled the frame, momentarily blocking the faint light. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, a silent, imposing figure against the swirling snow outside. She couldn't make out his features in the dim light, only the solid mass of him, the width of his shoulders. Fear paralyzed her. This was it. The end she had dreaded, arriving not with a whimper, but a silent, unknown presence. He stepped inside, letting the door close behind him, plunging the room back into deeper shadow, save for the pale light from the window. His footsteps were heavy, deliberate, crossing the room towards her. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for whatever was to come. He stopped a few feet away. Alara didn't open her eyes, but she could feel his presence, a quiet intensity that was different from the brutish force she had known. A long moment passed in silence, punctuated only by the relentless moan of the wind outside. Then, a soft metallic sound, the clinking of metal against wood. She risked opening her eyes, just a slit. He was crouched down, his back to her, facing the cold hearth. He had a tinderbox. A spark flew, a fragile star in the gloom. It caught the kindling, a tiny flame flickering to life. He added small pieces of wood, coaxing it, shielding it with his large hands. The light grew, casting his profile into sharp relief. Rugged features, a weathered face lined by sun and wind, thick, dark beard. He wasn't young, not old either. His movements were slow, deliberate, efficient. He added larger pieces of wood, and soon, a small, hopeful fire was burning in the hearth. The heat was a welcome kiss on her cold skin. He turned then, looking at her directly for the first time. His eyes were dark, steady, and held a depth of sorrow she recognized instantly. He said nothing. He simply studied her, taking in the bruises, the way she lay helpless on the floor, the fear etched on her face. He rose slowly, then knelt beside her. His hands were large, calloused. He reached for her injured leg. She flinched, a gasp escaping her lips. He paused, his gaze steady. "I won't hurt you," he said, his voice low, a rumble like distant thunder. It was the first sound he had made, and it was rough and used. He gently lifted the hem of her skirt, revealing the swelling, the unnatural angle. His touch was surprisingly soft, careful. He examined it without probing, his fingers tracing the line of the bone beneath the skin. He shook his head slightly, a quiet sigh escaping him. Bad break. He looked around the room, his gaze settling on a few discarded boards near the wall. He went to them, picked out 2 pieces solid and straight. He returned to the fire, using his knife to carefully smooth the edges, shaping them into makeshift splints. All done without another word. He tore strips from the thin blanket he had brought with him, thicker wool than hers, preparing ties. When he returned to her side, she didn't flinch this time. Her fear hadn't vanished, but it was tempered by a desperate hope, a fragile thread of trust woven from the simple acts of starting a fire and preparing splints. He worked with quiet concentration, his large hands surprisingly deft. He carefully positioned the boards along her leg, one on either side, immobilizing the break. He bound them tightly, but not so tight as to cut off circulation, securing them with the cloth strips. The process was painful, agony searing through her with each movement, but he worked swiftly and surely, his touch firm but gentle. He didn't offer platitudes or words of comfort, only focused on the task. When he was finished, he looked at her again. "It will hurt," he stated simply. "But it needs to heal straight." He rose and went back to the door, returning with a sack and a water skin. He knelt beside her again, opening the sack. Inside were wrapped bundles of food hardtack, some dry jerky, a small amount of beans. Simple, practical supplies. He offered her the water skin. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was rough, warm. She drank deeply, the water cool and life-giving. He didn't press her. He just watched. He stayed. He didn't announce it, didn't ask permission. He simply occupied the cabin alongside her. He slept by the fire, wrapped in his own blanket, a silent guardian. During the day, he went out, returning with firewood he chopped with an axe he kept slung over his shoulder, or occasionally a rabbit he had snared. He was a man of few words. His name, he grunted once, was Silas. That was it. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what had happened. He seemed to understand without needing to be told. Or perhaps he simply didn't care about the past, only the present necessity. He cooked the rabbits over the fire, sharing the meager portions equally. He heated water for her to wash, carefully helping her sit up without disturbing her leg. His presence was a steady, silent anchor in the chaos of her pain and fear. She watched him constantly when he was inside. His movements were economical, purposeful. He mended the drafty window with a spare piece of wood, fixed the latch on the door. Small acts that transformed the derelict cabin into something marginally more secure. She learned to anticipate his needs from his quiet actions, offering him the water dipper before he asked, pushing a piece of wood closer to the fire. A silent rhythm developed between them, a dance of necessity and unspoken understanding. As the days bled into weeks, the pain in her leg began to subside, replaced by a deep, persistent ache. She could move her toes now, could shift her weight slightly without the searing agony. Silas watched her progress with the same quiet intensity. He would check the splint, his dark eyes assessing. One afternoon, as she sat propped against the wall near the fire, flexing her foot tentatively, she found her voice. It was hoarse from disuse. "Why?" she asked, the single word hanging in the quiet air. He was mending a tear in his coat with thick thread. He paused, his large hands still. He didn't look at her immediately. He stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, long and heavy. She thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice low. "Saw you," he said, his gaze still on the flames. "Saw the tracks." Snowdrift was heavy, he didn't elaborate. He saw she was hurt, saw she was alone. That was enough. There was no pity in his voice, only a simple statement of fact. But in that simplicity was a profound act of recognition, of seeing her not as a burden, but as a human being in need. It was more than her husband had ever offered. She looked at him, really looked at him. The lines around his eyes weren't just from the sun. They were etched there by loss, by hardship. His solitude wasn't by choice, she suspected, but a consequence of life's blows. She saw a man who understood brokenness, perhaps from his own experience. She thought of the widower in the prompt title, a detail she had not known until now. Had he lost a wife, children? Was that the sorrow in his eyes? She didn't dare ask. The fragile trust between them felt too precious to risk with intrusive questions. Her leg was healing. Slowly, painfully, but healing. The splints were still necessary, but she could bear a little weight on it now with his support. He would help her stand, steadying her with a strong arm around her waist. His touch was impersonal, practical. Yet she felt the warmth of his hand through her thin dress, a strange comfort after so long without human contact that wasn't violent. One evening, as the wind howled outside, fiercer than usual, a new sound joined its lament. The heavy thud of horses' hooves, approaching the cabin. Silas stopped what he was doing, his body tensing. He moved to the window, peering out through the frost-streaked pane. His face, usually so impassive, was grim. "He's back," Silas stated, his voice low, dangerous. Alara's blood ran cold. The fear she had managed to push back, the terror of her husband, flooded her senses, paralyzing her. He had found her. After leaving her for dead, he had returned. Why? To finish the job? To retrieve something he'd forgotten? She scrambled back against the wall, her injured leg protesting with a sharp jolt of pain. Silas moved swiftly, silently. He grabbed the axe, its head gleaming dully in the firelight. He didn't hide it. He simply stood near the door, axe held loosely at his side, his posture radiating quiet readiness. The hooves stopped outside. A moment of silence. Then a loud, abusive shout. Her husband's voice. Drunk, angry. "Alara! You in there, you useless whore!" He kicked the door. It held. Silas had fixed the latch well. Another kick, harder. The wood groaned. Silas didn't move, his gaze fixed on the door. "Open up. I know you're in there. And who's with you?" The voice was laced with suspicion, with violent intent. Alara whimpered, covering her mouth with her hand to stifle the sound. Silas glanced at her, his dark eyes softening slightly for a fraction of a second before hardening again. He took a step closer to the door. "Go away," Silas said, his voice amplified by the wood, steady and deep. A moment of shocked silence from outside. Then, laughter, harsh and ugly. Well, got yourself a man, have you? Thought I left you broken and alone." Another kick, rattling the entire frame. "Send him out. We'll settle this." Silas didn't respond. He simply waited, a formidable obstacle between her husband and the cabin's interior. The kicking stopped. A pause. Then the sound of the axe being swung outside. Her husband was trying to break the door down. The thuds resonated through the cabin, each one a hammer blow against Alara's fragile sense of safety. Silas shifted his stance, tightening his grip on the axe. When the door finally splintered near the latch, Silas lunged, throwing the door open wide just as her husband was drawing back for another swing. The two men were face to face, illuminated by the faint light from the fire behind Silas and the pale snowscape behind her husband. Her husband was smaller than Silas, wiry and fueled by rage and liquor. He lunged forward, but Silas was ready. He didn't use the axe to cut, but to block, parrying her husband's wild swings, using its weight to keep him at bay. It wasn't a fight, but a brutal dance of defense. Silas didn't seek to injure, only to repel, to protect. Her husband, frustrated, began to shout obscenities, threats against Alara, against Silas. Alara, watching from her place on the floor, felt something shift inside her. The paralyzing fear began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard anger. This man, who had broken her, discarded her, now dared to threaten the one person who had shown her kindness, who had helped her. With a surge of adrenaline, ignoring the protest of her leg, she crawled towards the hearth, towards the burning fire. The struggle continued at the doorway, a silent, brutal ballet of force and resistance. Silas used the axe like a shield, deflecting her husband's flailing attacks, his movements economical and precise. He wasn't fighting to harm, but to deter. Her husband, wild-eyed and fueled by alcohol, was growing more desperate, more vicious in his attempts to get past Silas. "Let me in, you bastard!" he roared, spitting curses. "She's mine. She belongs to me." The words struck Alara like physical blows. Belongs to me. The familiar assertion of ownership, the reduction of her existence to property. It ignited a fire within her, hotter and fiercer than the one in the hearth. She reached the fire, her hands trembling. She grabbed the cast-iron poker, its tip glowing red-hot in the coals. It was heavy, awkward in her bruised hands, but the anger lent her strength. She pushed herself up onto her good knee, bracing herself with one hand against the cold stone of the hearth. Her injured leg dragged behind her, a dead weight. She wouldn't just wait for Silas to protect her. Not anymore. She was a participant in her own survival now. She crawled towards the doorway, the hot poker held awkwardly before her. Silas, still locked in his defensive struggle, hadn't seen her. Her husband saw her first. His eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in drunken fury. "You!" He lunged past Silas, forgetting caution in his rage. "I'll teach you to defy me." Silas reacted instantly, grabbing her husband's arm, but he was too late to stop the momentum entirely. Her husband stumbled towards her, his hand reaching out to grab her. Alara didn't hesitate. With a guttural cry, she swung the poker, aiming for his face. He flinched, dodging the worst of it, but the glowing tip grazed his arm. He yelled in pain, stumbling back. Silas used the opening, shoving her husband hard back out into the snow. "Get out!" Silas's voice was a low growl, full of lethal intent. "Don't come back," her husband, clutching his burned arm, glared back at them. A mixture of pain, rage, and something that looked like fear in his eyes. He muttered threats, promises of return, but they lacked conviction now. He stumbled back towards his horse, mounted it awkwardly, and rode away into the swirling snow, swallowed by the indifferent landscape from which he had emerged. Silence fell, broken only by the wind and Alara's ragged breathing. She still knelt by the doorway, poker clutched in her hand, the smell of burnt cloth and fear heavy in the air. Silas turned back to her. He knelt beside her, his gaze searching her face. He reached out, gently taking the poker from her trembling hand. He didn't say anything about her defiance, her action. He simply looked at her with those deep, dark eyes. There was respect there, and something else she couldn't quite name. He carefully helped her back towards the fire, settling her gently onto the blanket. He checked her splint, making sure it was still secure. He stoked the fire, adding more wood, filling the cabin with warmth and light. He prepared a simple meal of boiled beans, the aroma comforting and real. As they ate in silence, the air between them was different. The dynamic had shifted. She was no longer just the broken woman he had rescued. She was someone who had faced down her fear, who had fought back. She looked at him across the fire, the man who had appeared like a ghost in her hour of darkest need. He had saved her, yes, but not by being a hero in the stories. He had saved her by simply being present, by offering quiet, steady support, by providing the space and safety she needed to find her own strength. He was a widower, a man who carried his own burdens, yet he had stopped to lift hers. He hadn't demanded anything, hadn't judged. He had simply been. The snow continued to fall outside, but inside the cabin, a fragile sense of peace had settled. Elara watched Silas as he cleaned up, moving with his usual quiet efficiency. Her legs still hurt, a constant reminder of the past, but the throbbing was different now. It was the pain of healing, of mending. And she wasn't just mending physically. The fear that had been a cold stone in her stomach for so long had finally begun to dissolve, replaced by a quiet sense of resilience. She had faced her husband, faced the source of her pain and humiliation, and she hadn't shattered. She had fought back imperfectly, desperately, but she had fought, and she had survived. Silas finished his tasks and settled by the fire again. He didn't look at her directly, but she felt his awareness of her presence, a silent acknowledgement of their shared experience. He had witnessed her at her most vulnerable, and now at her most defiant. There was no judgment in his gaze, only that deep, quiet understanding. It was more than words could ever convey. She looked at her splinted leg, then at her hands, still smudged with soot from the poker. They were not the hands of a victim. They were the hands of a survivor. Her husband's return had not broken her further. It had tempered her, revealing a strength she hadn't known she possessed. And Silas, the silent stranger, had been the catalyst. He hadn't swooped in with grand pronouncements or impossible promises. He had simply built a fire, splinted her leg, shared his meager food, and stood guard. He had offered practical help, quiet companionship, and the unwavering belief in his actions that she was worth saving. It was in the shared silences, the steady gaze, the simple act of passing the waterskin, that their connection had formed. A bond forged in shared hardship, necessity, and unspoken respect. She knew he would not stay forever. He was a solitary man, used to the wide-open spaces, to his own company. But his time here had changed her life irrevocably. He had found her broken and left her mended, not just in body, but in spirit. The road ahead would still be hard. Her leg would take time to heal fully. She was still alone in this isolated cabin, though now with a small store of provisions and a secured door. But she wasn't the same woman who had lain there waiting to die. She had faced the darkness and found a spark of light within herself. She had met a quiet man who saw her humanity when others saw only weakness or property. He had stepped into her broken world and, by his simple, steady presence, helped her find her footing again. The world outside was still harsh, the future uncertain, but as she watched Silas watching the fire, a sense of quiet determination settled over her. She would heal. She would survive. She would rebuild, not for anyone else but for herself. The brokenness was not the end, but the beginning of a new path, one she would walk with newfound strength and dignity. And she would never forget the quiet man who had shared his fire and his strength, helping her rise from the ashes of despair. The wind still whispered secrets around the cabin, but they no longer sounded like whispers of death, but like promises of resilience, carried on the vast, indifferent air.